In the vast reaches of space, there existed civilizations far more advanced than humanity could ever imagine. Worlds of unimaginable beauty and complexity stretched across the galaxy, inhabited by creatures of every shape, color, and intellect. Among these beings, Zorkan stood as a towering figure, a being of immense power and wealth. He hailed from the planet Borelix, a place where strength ruled, and emotions were regarded as weaknesses to be conquered or suppressed. Zorkan was an alien billionaire, the wealthiest being in his sector, with riches beyond comprehension. His ships were enormous, capable of spanning the distance between planets in a matter of hours. His estate was a sprawling fortress, built into the side of a cliff that overlooked a vast ocean on Borelix. This mansion was not only his home, but also a symbol of his dominance over the galaxy. And in his pursuit of perfection, Zorkan had amassed a collection of exotic pets from various planets. These creatures, ranging from the graceful to the grotesque, were his trophies, symbols of his superior status. But one addition to his collection was different from the others: a human woman. Niara, a young black woman from Earth, had been bought at a galactic auction, her fate sealed by the highest bidder. To Zorkan, she was nothing more than an exotic curiosity, a pet to be trained and displayed at his whims. Her humanity, her culture, her very identity meant nothing to him. She was another acquisition, another possession to show off to his fellow elites. Niara's arrival on Borelix had been swift, a mere transaction that took place in the blink of an eye. She had been taken from her home, from Earth, from everything she had ever known, and placed in a world where she was completely insignificant. Zorkan, in all his power and arrogance, believed that a human's life was no more valuable than the rarest of artifacts or the most prized exotic species. In his grand mansion, Niara was relegated to the lowest of statuses, forced to dress in delicate silks that covered her body, but did little to hide the mark of her captivity. Zorkan made it clear from the start that she was to be obedient, to perform her duties with no question, no resistance. He expected nothing less than complete submission. The grandeur of his world, the cold, pristine halls of his estate, felt like a prison to her. But the more she resisted, the more Zorkan dismissed her attempts at defiance. He had never met a creature that didn't bend to his will, and he was certain she would be no different. But Niara was not like the others he had collected. She had a strength within her, something that Zorkan had never encountered before. It wasn't obvious at first. It was a quiet strength, the kind that came from surviving hardship, from overcoming adversity, the strength of a people who had endured centuries of struggle, pain, and oppression. Her gaze, though tired and resigned, held a fire that Zorkan could not fully understand. It intrigued him. It unsettled him. For now Zorkan saw Niara as an object, something to be displayed, something to be controlled. But deep within him, an unfamiliar sensation stirred. Was it pity? Was it curiosity? It was a feeling that Zorkan had long suppressed, the need to understand, to connect, but that would not come easily. Zorkan was a being of intellect and power, and emotions had no place in his world. He had no use for them. Yet, something about Niara's quiet presence, her dignity in the face of captivity, began to erode the walls Zorkan had built around himself. He wasn't sure why he cared. He didn't know if he cared, but he found himself watching her more and more, his interest in her growing by the day. Zorkan had everything he could ever want, but he was about to learn that there were some things that wealth and power could not buy. And in the cold corridors of his mansion, among the alien artifacts and strange, exotic creatures, the first crack in his carefully constructed world was beginning to form. Niara was not like the other pets that Zorkan had collected throughout his life. The others had been silent, obedient, and submissive, quickly adapting to their roles as trophies in his vast estate. But Niara was different. She had not chosen this fate. She had been taken from her home, from Earth, a place she once knew as a cradle of hope, pride, and rich culture. Now she was trapped, far from everything that had shaped her identity. Her first days on Borelix had been a blur of confusion and sorrow. Zorkan's mansion, with its towering spires and cold, sterile walls, was nothing like the warm, vibrant streets of her old neighborhood. The air was thin and unfamiliar, and the gravity of the planet made her feel heavier, as though the weight of her own body was a constant reminder of her captivity. Her hands, once accustomed to the rhythm of life on Earth, now shook as they performed the simple tasks that Zorkan demanded of her. She was dressed in silks, fine fabrics that felt alien against her skin. The clothes were meant to accentuate her beauty, to showcase her as a prized possession. Yet no matter how fine the clothing, Niara's spirit could not be hidden. Beneath the delicate fabric, her strength remained. Her lineage, forged through centuries of struggle and survival, ran deeper than any silk could ever cover. She thought about her family back on Earth, her mother's strong hands that had raised her, the sound of gospel music filling the air, and the comfort of the familiar streets where her ancestors had fought for freedom. The past felt like a distant memory now, a dream that was slowly fading as time on Borelix stretched on. But even in her grief, Niara knew one thing for sure. She was not meant to be a pet. Her identity, rooted in her black heritage, was something no alien could claim. She would not let Zorkan or anyone strip her of that. Zorkan had made it clear from the start that she was to be a servant, a silent, obedient being who existed only for his amusement. His orders were simple, his expectations high. She was to serve him, and in return, he would give her everything she needed. But no amount of material wealth could fill the emptiness she felt in her chest. Freedom was not something she could buy, and it was something Zorkan had never truly understood. She didn't speak much at first, choosing instead to observe the alien billionaire from a distance. His commands were given in a language that she could barely comprehend, but his tone was always clear. He was in control and she was meant to submit. And yet, every time he looked at her, there was a flicker of something in his eyes, a hesitation, a curiosity that unsettled him. Niara wasn't sure what it meant, but it was the first time she'd seen a crack in the unyielding facade of his power. Despite everything, Niara held on to the things that made her who she was. The lessons her grandmother had passed down, the pride of being black, the strength of her people, it was all in her blood, flowing through her veins, and it would not be so easily erased. As she moved about the mansion, her movements graceful and deliberate, Niara's mind began to shift. She could not accept this life, not for herself and not for the generations of her people who had fought for their freedom. Zorkan's power may have been absolute, but she had something he could never understand, the resilience of a people who had fought for survival through the darkest of times. In the silence of the grand halls, Niara found herself standing before a large window, looking out at the strange alien landscape of Borelix. The planet was beautiful, yes, but it was not home. Home was a place where she was free, where she could walk without fear, without being treated like an object. She placed a hand against the cool glass, her fingers tracing the faint lines of her reflection. She didn't know how she would escape, but she knew that one day she would. Her gaze shifted toward the door as she heard Zorkan's footsteps approaching. He had been watching her for some time now, his interest piqued by the defiance she carried so effortlessly. She did not cower in his presence. She did not shrink away from his gaze. She met him with the same steady strength that had been passed down to her, generation after generation, and in that moment, Zorkan realized that Niara was unlike any being he had ever encountered. As he entered, his eyes met hers, and for a brief second, there was something unspoken between them. She saw the flicker of doubt in his eyes, and he saw the fire in hers. It was clear. Niara was not a pet. She was a woman with her own history, her own pride, and her own strength, and no matter what he did, he could not take that from her. Zorkan had always believed himself to be above the trivialities of emotions. His life on Borelix, one of the most technologically advanced planets in the galaxy, had shaped him into a being who valued intellect, power, and control. His empire was built on these principles, and for years he had surrounded himself with creatures from countless worlds, each one unique, yet all ultimately reduced to mere objects, trophies to display his dominance. But Niara was different. He watched her from across the room as she moved with quiet dignity, the silk of her garments swishing softly as she performed her duties. She wasn't the docile, submissive creature he had expected. There was a fire in her eyes, a resilience that spoke of defiance even in the face of the impossible. At first he dismissed it as a fleeting annoyance, an insignificant challenge that would fade with time. But days turned into weeks, and still Niara did not bend. She did not break. Zorkan had never seen anything like it. Her silence was not one of submission, but one of contemplation. She held herself with a quiet strength, like a person who had lived through suffering and yet still carried herself with pride. It unsettled him in a way he couldn't quite understand. The other pets, his collection of creatures, were content to follow his orders without question, without thought. But Niara seemed to carry a weight far beyond her physical form. There was a history behind her eyes, a story he could not access, and that intrigued him more than he cared to admit. The mansion, with its cold, imposing walls, seemed to close in around her as she moved through it. To Zorkan, it was a place of control, a sanctuary built to keep him separate from the common, the weak. But to Niara, it was a prison. She did not speak much, but when she did, it was always measured, her words sharp and full of a quiet power. There were moments when Zorkan caught a glimpse of something beneath the surface, something fierce, something that reminded him of a strength he had never had to cultivate. One evening, as the orange glow of the setting sun filtered through the grand windows of his estate, Zorkan found himself watching her again. She was standing by the window, looking out at the strange landscape of Borilix. The sky was painted with hues of red and purple, the strange flora of the planet swaying in the breeze. It was beautiful, alien, yet Niara remained still, as if lost in her thoughts. "What do you see, human?" Zorkan's voice cut through the silence, though it wasn't harsh. It was the first time he had directly addressed her in some time, and his tone was laced with curiosity. Niara didn't turn to him, she didn't even flinch. "I see a world I'll never understand," she said, her voice calm but heavy with meaning. "A place that's not my home." Zorkan's brow furrowed, his usual arrogance giving way to a momentary flicker of confusion. "Your home? You are here now. You belong here." "No," Niara said, her back still to him. "I belong to Earth, to my people." Her words struck him in a way he hadn't expected. He could sense the weight of her heritage in those words, the history behind them. Earth. It was a name he had heard before, but it meant little to him. To Zorkan, the planets were interchangeable, just dots on a map, each with its own creatures to collect, its own resources to exploit. But Earth had clearly shaped Niara in a way he could not comprehend. Zorkan took a step closer, his gaze fixed on the back of her head. "And your people?" he asked, a touch of genuine curiosity in his voice. "What makes them so different from the others?" Niara finally turned to face him, her eyes meeting his with a quiet intensity. "We fight," she said simply. "We fight for freedom, for dignity, for what's ours. We've fought for centuries." Zorkan was taken aback by the rawness in her voice. He had expected her to be defeated, to be resigned to her fate. Instead, he found a woman who was unbroken, whose very presence seemed to challenge everything he thought he knew about power and control. "You speak of freedom," Zorkan said, his voice tinged with skepticism. "But here on Borilix, freedom is an illusion. Power is what matters." Niara's gaze softened, but her expression remained firm. "Freedom isn't an illusion," she said, her voice steady. "It's something you can take if you fight hard enough for it." Zorkan didn't respond. The words lingered in the air between them, and for the first time he felt a stirring within him, a flicker of doubt. He had never considered freedom to be something worth fighting for. He had always believed that power was the ultimate goal, but Niara's words, her quiet defiance, made him wonder if there was more to life than just control. As Niara turned back to the window, Zorkan lingered in the silence. His thoughts, once ordered and clear, now felt jumbled and uneasy. He was used to controlling everything, but Niara, she was the first thing in his life he couldn't simply dominate. And for reasons he couldn't yet explain, that realization both troubled and intrigued him. The days seemed to stretch on without end in Zorkan's mansion. Nyara had grown accustomed to the cold, sterile halls and the oppressive silence that followed her every move. Every day was the same, performing her tasks with precision, her steps measured, her eyes never meeting Zorkan's unless ordered. But something was changing inside her, something she hadn't fully understood yet. It wasn't just the loneliness or the isolation. It was a deeper feeling, one that made her chest tighten and her throat ache. One evening, as she stood in the vast dining hall preparing the table for one of Zorkan's rare formal dinners, a deep sense of helplessness washed over her. She had been working for hours, the constant bustle of preparing the lavish spread only accentuating the emptiness she felt. Every dish, every glass, every utensil was meticulously placed, as if she were a part of the decor rather than a person. Zorkan entered the room, his imposing presence filling the space. His sharp eyes immediately focused on her, taking in the details of the setup. He made a quick motion with his hand, signaling her to step back as he inspected her work. Nyara stood still, her back straight, her gaze lowered. She didn't expect praise, nor did she desire it. She simply wanted to disappear, to be anywhere but here, in this place that reduced her to nothing more than a servant. But something inside her cracked at that moment. The weight of her captivity, the sense of being nothing more than an object to be displayed and controlled, became unbearable. Her fingers, trembling slightly, reached for the cloth on the table, smoothing it down for the umpteenth time, and then it happened. A single tear slid down her cheek, warm and silent. It was as though the floodgates had opened, and the emotion she had been suppressing for so long poured out in that one fragile moment. She quickly wiped it away, her heart racing, hoping Zorkan hadn't noticed. But he had. Zorkan had been watching her, his gaze steady and calculating. He noticed the subtle shift in her posture, the way her shoulders sagged just a little. And then he saw the tear, small, almost imperceptible, but undeniably real. For a moment, neither of them moved. The silence between them was thick, charged with an unspoken tension that neither knew how to address. Zorkan's mind raced, his thoughts swirling as he tried to understand what he was seeing. "You cry?" Zorkan's voice was low, almost curious. He had seen many beings express emotions, but the way Nyara's sadness seemed to permeate the air around her was different. It was not the helplessness of a pet or the fear of a captive. It was something deeper, something more human. Nyara didn't respond at first. She didn't trust herself to speak, afraid that if she did, the floodgates would open wider, drowning her in a tide of emotion she couldn't control. Her chest tightened with the weight of everything she had lost, everything she longed for: Earth, her family, her freedom. "I don't want your pity," she finally said, her voice raw though she did her best to keep it steady. "I just want to be free." Zorkan stood there, his eyes narrowing slightly as he processed her words. The intensity in her gaze was something he had never encountered before. She wasn't looking for his sympathy. She was demanding something from him, something he hadn't anticipated. "You think you are the first to be taken from your home?" Zorkan asked, his tone laced with an edge of condescension. "I have seen entire species fall before my power. What makes you think you deserve freedom?" Nyara raised her head, her eyes meeting his for the first time in what felt like an eternity. Her voice was quiet but fierce. "Because I am more than what you see. You can take my body, but you can't take my soul." Zorkan's breath caught in his chest, and for a brief, fleeting moment, he felt something stir inside him. It wasn't pity, nor was it anger. It was something else, something raw and unsettling, a sense of respect. Or perhaps it was something deeper, something he couldn't yet name. For a long while they stood in silence, the air between them thick with unspoken words. Zorkan finally broke the quiet, his voice lower now, tinged with something new. "You are different, human. I don't understand it." Nyara didn't answer right away. Her tear had long since dried, but the emotional storm it had triggered remained. She didn't know what this moment meant, what Zorkan's words truly meant. But one thing was certain: for the first time he had seen her, not as a pet, not as an object, but as a person. And that alone made her believe that maybe, just maybe, there was hope for her yet. In the days that followed Nyara's tear, Zorkan found himself thinking about her more than he cared to admit. The human woman had always been an enigma to him, an object to be studied, yes, but also something more. He had tried to push aside the strange feelings that stirred within him when he looked at her. Emotions, after all, were a weakness, a vulnerability in a world that valued power above all else. Yet no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't stop the thoughts that plagued him. Niara had changed something in him. Her defiance, her strength, and the quiet sorrow in her eyes had cracked through his armor, the impenetrable shell that had kept his emotions at bay for so long. He couldn't understand it, but he found himself more and more intrigued by her. She was unlike any being he had encountered. Her resilience was a quiet force that stirred something in his gut. Her refusal to bow to him, to accept her place as a mere possession, made him question his own beliefs about control and dominance. He began to observe her more closely. Her movements, always deliberate, always graceful, seemed to carry a weight that he couldn't ignore. When she spoke, her voice was low but firm, a testament to the strength she still held inside. It was as if every word, every glance was an act of resistance. Zorkan found it both frustrating and fascinating. He had always been the one in control, but Niara was making him feel like he was the one losing grip. One evening, as Zorkan sat in the expansive library of his mansion, his eyes scanning through documents and reports, his mind kept wandering back to her. She was supposed to be nothing more than a pet, a collection item. But the more time he spent with her, the more he realized that he couldn't treat her like the others. Niara wasn't some fragile thing to be broken or shaped into what he wanted. She was strong in a way he didn't fully understand, and that strength had started to affect him in ways he couldn't explain. Niara, too, had noticed the shift in the atmosphere. She had always known that Zorkan was different from the others. There was something about him that set him apart. His arrogance, his wealth, his power, they were all evident in his presence. But there was also a complexity to him, something buried beneath the surface that she had begun to see glimpses of. She had felt it the day she had shed her first tear, the day she had seen that flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. She wasn't sure what it meant, but something had changed in the way he treated her. No longer was she just a silent servant, someone to be dismissed with a wave of his hand. He had started speaking to her more, asking questions she didn't expect. Sometimes he seemed almost interested in her answers. It was a small thing, but it was enough to make her heart race with cautious hope. One night, while she was in the garden, tending to the flowers that Zorkan had insisted on keeping for decoration, she felt his presence behind her. It wasn't the usual commanding presence, the one that made her tense and anxious. This time it was different, subtle, almost tentative. "You've been here for some time now," Zorkan said, his voice carrying across the garden like a soft breeze. "How do you find it?" Niara didn't look up immediately. She was afraid that if she did, she might betray herself. She had learned to keep her emotions in check, to never let them show. But there was something in his tone, something that made her feel like she could be honest. "It's beautiful," she said after a moment, "but it's not my home." Zorkan remained silent, the words lingering in the air between them. She could feel his eyes on her, but she didn't look up. Instead, she focused on the petals in her hands, pretending to arrange them in some order that made sense, though in truth she was only trying to distract herself from the rising emotions inside her. "You are different from the others," Zorkan said, his voice low but not unkind. "I can't figure you out." Niara's heart skipped a beat. For the first time, he wasn't dismissing her. He wasn't talking down to her. There was something else in his voice, something raw. She wasn't sure what it meant, but she couldn't ignore the feeling that he was finally seeing her as something more than just a pet. "You don't need to figure me out," Niara said softly. "You just need to see me for what I am." Zorkan took a step closer, though he didn't say anything at first. He stood there for a moment as if contemplating her words before speaking again. "I don't know how to see you," he admitted quietly, "but I'm starting to wonder if you're not what I thought you were." The air between them thickened, and for a moment neither of them moved. Niara didn't know what to say to that, but she felt a flicker of something inside her. She had fought for so long to hold on to her pride, to remain strong in the face of everything that had been taken from her. But now she wasn't sure. Maybe there was something more to this than just surviving. Maybe there was a chance, however small, for something better. She didn't know what the future held, but in that moment she allowed herself a glimmer of hope. Zorkan had never considered the inner lives of the beings he collected. To him they were novelties, rare creatures from distant worlds, beautiful in form but empty in depth. Yet Nyara had become an anomaly. She was not just beautiful, she was deliberate, alive in ways that unsettled him. It wasn't just her resistance that intrigued him, it was the layers beneath it. Every look, every word she offered was a window into a life he had never tried to understand before. He found himself seeking her presence more often, no longer just watching but listening. Their conversations, once sparse and forced, had taken on a rhythm of their own. She spoke of Earth when he asked, though only in fragments. She didn't trust him, not entirely, but she no longer feared him either. It was subtle, the way her shoulders relaxed when he entered the room, the way her eyes no longer held only defiance, but curiosity. "You come from a lineage of fighters," Zorkan said one evening, seated across from her in the solarium, the twin moons of Borelix casting pale light over the glass walls. "That is clear." Nyara looked at him, her face unreadable for a moment. "We had to be," she said softly. "We were stolen from our land, scattered, enslaved, erased. But we fought. In every generation, we fought to exist, to reclaim what was taken." Her voice held no anger, just a quiet conviction that struck him harder than fury ever could. Zorkan absorbed her words in silence. This history was foreign to him. His species had always seen themselves as conquerors. They expanded, absorbed, dominated. To them, resistance was only a delay, not a destiny. But Nyara's story wasn't just resistance, it was survival with dignity. And he didn't know how to respond to that. "I never knew humans carried such fire," he said eventually. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "You never cared to look," he nodded, accepting the truth of it. "And now I'm looking." That admission surprised them both. Zorkan had begun to change, though he wasn't sure when or how. The cold logic that once governed his every decision had started to fray. He found himself questioning not just his treatment of Nyara, but the very foundation of his power. Was control truly the highest form of respect? Or had he been wrong all along? Nyara, for her part, was wary. She had seen powerful men feign softness before, only to reassert their dominance when trust became vulnerability. But Zorkan wasn't pretending. There was a clumsy sincerity to him now, like someone who had spent their whole life underwater and was suddenly learning to breathe air. "I don't want to be your teacher," she said one afternoon, after he had asked her to explain a piece of earth music she'd been humming. "It's not my job to educate the man who owns me." Zorkan stiffened, the weight of the word "own" settling heavy in the air between them. "You are right," he said after a pause. "But you are the first being who's made me want to learn." She studied him then, really studied him. There was no manipulation in his eyes, no cruelty hiding behind curiosity. Only a man, an alien, yes, but still a man, grappling with a truth he could no longer ignore. And that was perhaps the most human thing about him. As their days grew longer, their talks deeper, the space between them began to shift. Nyara still kept her guard up, but cracks had formed, enough for glimpses of warmth to slip through. Zorkan, too, found himself reshaped by every exchange. Her stories of earth, of black resilience, music, laughter in the midst of pain, became his new obsessions. He found her world richer than anything he had conquered, more layered than any empire he had built. Yet with every moment shared, Nyara made sure he understood. Her openness was not submission. It was her choice, her power. And if he wanted her truth, he had to earn it. Zorkan didn't speak this aloud, but he understood. Perhaps for the first time in his life, he understood something not with his mind but with his soul, and it terrified him. Word traveled fast in elite circles, even across the stars. It wasn't long before the whispers began. Zorkan, the iron-willed collector, the master of power and control, had grown soft. The rumors were subtle at first. An alien noble here, a merchant tycoon there, all murmuring of the human woman who had captured the attention of one of the most feared billionaires in the galaxy. They mocked him in private gatherings, suggesting that his fascination was weakness disguised as curiosity. Zorkan didn't care for gossip, but he wasn't blind to the shift in how others looked at him. His rivals, particularly Lord Vator of the Uktari Dominion, had begun circling like predators sensing blood. Vator, a long-standing competitor in the high-stakes world of exotic acquisitions, had never missed an opportunity to undermine Zorkan. And now, with the whispers growing, he saw an opening. "You're losing your edge," Vator said during a diplomatic gathering on Marshera Prime. The words were cloaked in false cordiality, but the challenge beneath them was clear. "We hear you've become emotionally invested in your latest acquisition." Zorkan's eyes narrowed, his voice cool. "Careful, Vator. Not everything you hear is truth." Vator chuckled. "Maybe. But if you start treating pets like people, the whole galaxy starts wondering who's really in control." Back on Borelix, Zorkan's discomfort grew. The estate, once his sanctuary, now felt exposed. He increased security. Scanners swept the air more frequently. Guards patrolled the outer walls. Nyara noticed the tension, the way Zorkan moved with unease, no longer the unshakable force he had once been. One evening, as she passed through the hall near the command room, she overheard him speaking to his security chief. "Do not let anyone near her quarters without clearance from me. No servants, no visitors, no one." "Yes, my lord. But is there a threat?" Zorkan paused. "There are always threats when others believe you've found something worth protecting." Nyara's heart tightened at his words. She wasn't sure what disturbed her more, the idea of being protected like property, or the thought that someone might want to harm her to get to him. Either way, she knew her presence here had become dangerous in a new, more complicated way. The threat became real 2 nights later. It started as a power fluctuation, common enough in the vast estate. But then the security shields flickered, and the eastern wing was breached. Zorkan's forces responded swiftly, but by the time they arrived, a small drone had already made it past the first barrier. It was fast, surgical, programmed to capture and extract. It targeted only one room, Nyara's. She had been reading in the chamber Zorkan had reluctantly upgraded for her, less like a prison now, more like a guest's quarters. When the drone smashed through the window, she reacted instinctively, ducking beneath the bed frame as glass scattered across the floor. The drone's clawed appendages clicked, scanning the room. It advanced quickly, sensing her presence. Just as it began to lower its arms, Zorkan burst through the doorway, weapon in hand. A blast of searing light struck the drone mid-chassis, sending it crashing to the floor in a burst of sparks. Smoke filled the room as alarms screamed through the halls. Zorkan crossed to Nyara in 2 strides. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, heart pounding. What was that?" "A warning," he said darkly, looking down at the smoldering wreck. "Or a promise." Later, after the chaos had died down and repairs began, Zorkan stood in the ruins of her quarters. His jaw was tight, his eyes hard. Nyara stood beside him, her body still trembling from the encounter, but her voice calm. "This is what happens when you treat people like things. Someone always wants to take them." Zorkan didn't argue. He simply nodded, the weight of her words sinking deeper than he expected. He had made her vulnerable by bringing her into his world. Now, for the first time, he truly understood what it meant to be responsible for another life, not as a possession, but as a person. And somewhere deep within, he felt something he had never allowed himself to feel before: fear. Zorkan's private quarters had never felt so constricting. After the attack, the mansion's walls seemed to echo with more than just the sounds of patrolling guards. They carried tension, unsaid fears, and questions he no longer knew how to answer. For the first time in his life, someone had dared to touch what was his, and it wasn't about power or dominance anymore. It was about her. He replayed the moment over and over. Her crouched form beneath the shattered window, the fear in her eyes. Not because she feared him, but because she was under attack, vulnerable, and he hadn't protected her. Not really. He'd brought her into this world, this life of danger disguised as luxury, and assumed his ownership meant safety. He was wrong. Niara hadn't spoken much since the attack. She hadn't retreated into herself, but she had grown quiet, measured. She watched him now, not like a captive, but like a woman trying to understand whether the man standing before her was capable of anything more than control. That afternoon, as she sat on the edge of a low stone bench in the garden, her sanctuary, Zorkan approached, slower than usual, uncertain. "You shouldn't be out here," he said quietly. "The risk is too high." "I know," Niara replied, not looking at him. "But if I stay hidden, I'll start to believe I'm still in a cage." Zorkan sat beside her, not too close. "I've failed to keep you safe." Niara glanced at him, studying the rare vulnerability in his posture. "You didn't bring that drone here, but you made me visible." He winced. The truth cut sharper than any blade. "I thought if I gave you comfort, some dignity—" "You thought dignity could be given?" she interrupted, voice low but sharp. "It's not a gift. It's something you respect. Or take." There was no malice in her voice, just honesty. Zorkan nodded slowly. "I never understood what you were to me," he admitted. "I don't think I even saw you. Not truly." Niara stood and walked a few paces away, arms folded across her chest. The wind stirred the hem of her tunic, the warm borealic sun casting long shadows across the garden floor. "I'm not asking you to understand me," she said. "I'm asking you to recognize me, as a woman, as a person, not a pet, not a possession." He rose, stepping toward her. "And if I did?" His voice was rough with something unfamiliar. Not dominance, not pride, maybe remorse. "Then you'd be the first person here who ever has." The silence between them held the weight of a galaxy. Later that evening, Niara returned to her quarters and found a stack of books resting on her table. They weren't alien scripts or political texts. They were translations of Earth literature, works from the African diaspora, digitally transferred, restored, and preserved from archives she hadn't seen in years. Langston Hughes, Toni Morrison, Baldwin, Angelo. She stared at them for a long moment, her throat tightening. No words, just the overwhelming recognition of something deeply familiar. Zorkan didn't say he'd placed them there. He didn't have to. She knew. When she next saw him, she said only, "Thank you." Zorkan gave a short nod. "I had them retrieved from the Galactic Historical Registry. I wanted to understand what shaped you. You can't read these and expect to know me," she said, one eyebrow arched. "No," he agreed, "but I can listen to the voices that came before you." For the first time, Niara smiled, not out of amusement, not out of politeness, but out of something warm, cautious, and real. She didn't trust him, not fully. But in that moment, she didn't hate him either. "I'm not here to fix you," she said. "I'm here to survive you." Zorkan didn't flinch. "And I'm here to learn what that means." And for the first time, neither of them needed to say more. Zorkan had never believed in the concept of transformation. Evolution, yes, change driven by superiority, power, necessity. But transformation implied emotion, vulnerability, surrender. Those were foreign languages to him, ones his people never taught. And yet here he was, lying awake in the dead silence of his chambers, replaying every word Niara had spoken over the last week like scripture. He had watched civilizations rise and fall, had traded in lives like currency, but nothing had ever haunted him the way her voice did now, not her defiance, not even her pain. It was her presence, unapologetically human, fiercely black, endlessly proud, that unsettled everything he once believed about worth, identity, and dominance. Niara was more than a challenge. She had become a mirror, and Zorkan was starting to hate what he saw in his own reflection. He rose before dawn and found her already awake, seated beneath the massive canopy of an alien tree that twisted purple leaves through the courtyard's filtered starlight. She looked peaceful, but distant, guarded, as always. "I can't sleep," he admitted. Niara didn't look at him. Guilt does that to a man. He didn't argue. He sat beside her, careful to keep space between them. though his chest ached with the need to close it. "I don't know how to carry this," he said, after a long pause. "This feeling." She tilted her head slightly, studying the lines on his face, the tightness in his jaw. "What do you think you're feeling?" "I think I'm changing. And I don't know who I'll be when it's done." Her eyes softened, just a touch. "That's fear. It means you're alive." He let out a slow breath. "You did this to me." "I didn't do anything. I just refused to disappear." The truth of it struck him harder than any accusation. He had made people vanish, into prisons, into contracts, into silence. But Niara had remained visible, loudly, defiantly present in a world that demanded her submission, and that act, simple as it seemed, had dismantled his entire framework. "I see you," he said quietly. "For now. I mean it." Niara turned to face him fully. "Do you know what it cost me to be seen by you? To survive here, not as a ghost, but as a woman with a voice? I think I'm starting to understand." "Then understand this too. Seeing me doesn't absolve you. It doesn't erase what you did, or what you are." Zorkan nodded, shame washing over him like heat. "I don't want absolution. I want to deserve your truth." Niara's eyes searched his face for something. Sincerity, perhaps, or the shape of regret. What she found was a man trembling at the edge of something he had never allowed himself to feel. "I'm not here to heal you," she said. "I know. I'm not your redemption arc. I don't want you to be." They sat in silence again, the alien wind rustling the foliage, casting long shadows across their bodies. Zorkan stared at his hands, hands that had taken so much, controlled so many. And yet, for the first time, he wondered what they could offer if not domination. "I care about you," he said suddenly, the words foreign and heavy on his tongue. "More than I thought possible." Niara inhaled, her posture tightening. "Don't say that unless you know what it means." "I don't," he admitted, "but I want to learn." Her face softened just slightly. "Caring is a beginning, but it's not enough, not here, not with me." He nodded slowly. "Then I'll start with the beginning." For the first time, Niara didn't pull away. She didn't smile, didn't melt into his confession, but she didn't shut him out either. That alone was monumental. In his world, love was weakness. On Borelix, compassion was currency only the foolish spent. But as dawn broke over the horizon, painting the sky in deep blues and golds, Zorkan felt something shift inside him, a gravitational pull toward a truth he'd never known he needed, and that truth had a name. Niara. The backlash was immediate. Zorkan's shift in behavior hadn't gone unnoticed. Among the Borelian elite, where dominance was revered and emotions considered primitive, whispers had become accusations. His rivals, especially Vetor, were no longer content with murmured mockery. They saw his connection to Niara not as a personal failing, but as a political liability, a crack in the foundation of Borelian superiority. And where they saw weakness, they prepared to strike. In the central chamber of the Council of Titans, Zorkan stood before his peers. The room was cold, circular, with towering obsidian columns that seemed to lean in, listening. Dozens of eyes, slitted, glowing, ancient, bore down on him. "You've lost perspective," Vetor said, stepping forward, his voice a weapon. "A human. You defend her, shield her. You call her equal. What message does that send to the outer sectors? That our rule is negotiable? That our customs bend to sentiment?" Zorkan didn't flinch. "It sends the message that sentience demands respect, that power without conscience is tyranny." Murmurs rippled through the chamber. To speak of tyranny in Borelian politics was near blasphemy. "She is manipulating you," another elder hissed. "She weeps and you betray your nature." "She does not manipulate me," Zorkan said. "She mirrors me, forces me to confront what we've built this empire upon, ownership, fear, control. And what have we truly gained from it?" "You gained everything," Vetor barked. "You stood above the rest. Now you'd throw it away for a woman who would kill you in your sleep if given the chance." Zorkan's jaw tightened. Then she's the only honest voice I've ever known. The council exploded in noise, disbelief, fury, threats masked in decorum. But Zorkan had made his position clear. There would be no retreat. Back at the estate, Nyara sensed the storm brewing. The air felt charged, like lightning held in a glass jar. Zorkan returned from the council late, his face harder than she'd seen in weeks. "They want you gone," he said simply. Nyara didn't look surprised. "They always did. They'll try again. Let them." He stared at her, frustration and admiration mixing uneasily. "You speak as if you don't understand the danger." "I understand it better than you do," she replied. "I've lived it since birth. I come from a people who faced annihilation and built life from the ashes. You think I'm afraid of men who sneer behind silk robes?" "You're not afraid," he murmured. "That's what terrifies them." She approached him slowly, her gaze steady. "Then choose, Zorkan. Not between me and them, but between the man they raised and the man you're becoming." He looked away, the choice clawing at him. His identity had been forged in the fires of conquest, in systems designed to crush dissent and glorify control. To walk away from that wasn't just rebellion, it was rebirth. And rebirth always came with pain. "I'm not ready," he confessed, the words burning his tongue. Nyara nodded. "You don't have to be ready, you just have to be honest." Silence settled between them like dusk. That night, Zorkan stood alone on the western balcony, the city lights of Borelix flickering in the distance like stars falling in reverse. He thought of everything he had been taught, the legacy he was expected to preserve. But all he could hear was her voice, steady, brave, unrelenting. A woman who had lost everything and still stood tall. He didn't know what the next day would bring. Political exile, assassination, war. But for the first time in his life, he felt no shame in his doubt, no guilt in his desire to change, and somewhere deep in his core, beneath the layers of pride and power, something began to settle. Conviction. The tension that had been building between Zorkan and his council reached its breaking point when word spread that Nyara had been marked for removal. Zorkan's rivals were relentless. The whispers became demands. The subtle manipulations turned into threats. They wanted her gone, out of sight, erased from his life, and Zorkan knew they would not stop until she was. He paced the length of his private quarters, a storm of conflicting emotions threatening to tear through his carefully constructed composure. Power, control. These were the cornerstones of his existence, his empire. And now, this woman, this human, had infiltrated it all. She had torn down walls he had spent a lifetime building, and for the first time in his life, Zorkan didn't know what to do. Nyara had become his most treasured possession, but also his most dangerous. She was the reflection of everything he had never allowed himself to confront, his choices, his authority, his solitude. She was everything that was human, everything he had tried to suppress and subjugate, and now she was everything he was forced to protect. The council had given him an ultimatum: remove her, or risk losing his position, his empire. It was a decision that threatened the very core of his identity. Zorkan knew what he had to do. He had been taught from an early age to never show weakness, to sacrifice whatever necessary to maintain control. But as he stood in front of the window, gazing out at the sprawling city of Borelix beneath him, he realized how much he had already sacrificed. His life, his comfort, his cold, indifferent empire, none of it had brought him peace. And Nyara, despite being the very symbol of his defiance, had begun to change that. "I can't let them do this," he muttered to himself. His fists clenched, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. If he let her go, if he betrayed her, what would remain? Another conquered world? Another soulless victory? He had seen the price of control his entire life, but now it felt too high. Nyara's presence in his mind was like a steady hum in the background of his thoughts. Her strength, her courage, her refusal to be anyone's possession. She had taught him something he had never known, that power meant nothing without heart, without vulnerability. She had been the one to challenge him, to ask for something that he couldn't give her: equality, freedom. He turned abruptly from the window, his face set with a new resolve. It was a decision he should have made long ago. Nyara was in the library when he found her, sitting at one of the long tables reading. Her expression was serene, absorbed in the pages before her, but Zorkan could see the tightness in her shoulders, the slight weariness in her eyes. She had known something was coming. She had known he was being pulled in two directions, as if the universe itself had conspired to force him to choose. She didn't look up as he approached, but the moment he spoke, she knew. "You've made your choice." "I have," he replied, his voice softer than he intended. "And it's not what they think." She set the book aside, finally meeting his gaze. There was no anger, no accusation, only the quiet weight of her understanding. "What does it mean?" she asked, voice barely a whisper. "It means that I will stand by you," he said, each word coming with the weight of a promise he never thought he'd make. "It means that I'll fight for your freedom, for your life, because you are more than just a possession to me." Her breath caught in her throat, and for the first time in a long while she allowed herself to show the vulnerability she had buried deep within her. Zorkan saw it, the fleeting flicker of hope, of trust. It was all she had ever wanted, and now it was here, in the most unlikely of places. "But that means everything will change," she warned him, her voice steady but edged with uncertainty. "You'll lose it all, your power, your status, your empire." "I'm willing to lose it," Zorkan said, his voice resolute. "Because I've never had anything worth keeping until now." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The air was thick with what had been said and what remained unspoken. The consequences of Zorkan's choice were clear. He was willing to give up everything he had built. He was willing to risk his own life, his own legacy, for Nyara's freedom. It was a choice that would forever alter the course of his life. But in that silence, he knew that it was the right one. The night after Zorkan's decision felt different. The atmosphere had shifted, but the weight of what they both faced still lingered. Nyara stood by the grand window of her quarters, gazing out at the city below. The lights of Borelix flickered like distant stars, and for the first time they didn't seem so far away. The world outside was still, yet inside, everything was moving. Zorkan's voice broke the silence. "I'm not sure what happens next." She didn't turn to face him immediately. The vulnerability in his words caught her off guard. She had always known Zorkan as a man of control, someone who never showed uncertainty. But now there was something new, a sense of openness, of raw humanity. It unsettled her, yet it made her feel something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. Hope. "You're not the only one uncertain," she said, her voice softer than she intended. "But maybe that's where we start." Zorkan stepped into the room, his presence as commanding as always, but there was a difference. He wasn't demanding her attention, he was simply waiting, as if the space between them had become a delicate balance. "What happens to us now, Nyara? If you're free, if this is real, what does that mean for us?" She met his gaze, her heart pounding in her chest. This was the question, the one that had haunted her from the beginning. Could she trust him, really? Could she let go of the years of pain, of captivity, and embrace the man standing before her? For the first time, "I think I have a choice," she said, her words deliberate, though they trembled slightly. "And that choice is mine, to be free. To be me." Zorkan's eyes softened as he processed her words. "And if that means leaving? If that means walking away from everything? Me, this life?" Nyara's breath caught in her throat. For a moment, she was speechless. The weight of what he was offering, freedom, real freedom, felt both terrifying and exhilarating. But this was not about escape. It was about standing in her truth, no matter where it led. "If I leave," she said, her voice steady, "it's not because I don't care about you. It's because I need to see who I am without the shadow of captivity, without the chains of someone else's rules." The room seemed to close in around them, the silence thick with unsaid things. Zorkan didn't speak immediately. His gaze held hers, not with the possessiveness he had once shown, but with an understanding that made her heart ache. "Then go," he said finally, his voice quiet but firm. "If that's what you need." Nyara's eyes widened, surprised by the gentleness in his tone. "You're letting me go?" "I'm not keeping you," he replied. "You're not mine to keep." "You never were." The words were simple, but the weight behind them was immense. For the first time, Zorkan had truly understood what it meant to love, without ownership, without control. It wasn't a lesson he had learned easily, but it was the one thing that had remained constant in his thoughts since that first tear fell from Nyara's eyes. He had not seen her as a person, not until now. Nyara stood still for a long moment, her heart torn between the woman she had been and the woman she was becoming. She had never imagined this, her freedom, her independence. And yet, here it was, standing in front of her like a door she could walk through. "I don't know where this will take me," she said, her voice softer now. "But I know I need to take that step. For me, for my people, for my future." Zorkan nodded. "I'll help you, in any way I can." Her eyes softened, and for the first time, she allowed herself to believe it, not in the grand gestures, not in the promises, but in the quiet understanding that had begun to take root between them. This was real. This was something new. "I'm not asking for your help, Zorkan," she said, a small smile tugging at her lips. "I'm asking for your respect, and I think I've finally earned it." Zorkan's heart clenched at her words, but this time it wasn't fear. It was something else, a sense of peace. He had let go of the woman who had once been his possession and had watched her grow into the person she had always been meant to be. "I respect you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "More than I ever thought possible." As she turned to leave, Zorkan's gaze followed her. He had once seen his empire as a collection of assets to be protected, but now, for the first time, he saw it differently. His empire was vast, but it would never be enough without the heart he had found in her. Nyara was free, and so was he. Zorkan stood by the balcony, watching the horizon of Borelix. The twin suns were setting, casting an ethereal glow across the landscape. The sky bled in hues of orange and purple, a stark contrast to the cold, sterile walls of his estate. For the first time, he didn't feel isolated in his own thoughts. There was something he had come to realize in the days following Nyara's departure from the mansion. He was no longer content with just control. His power felt hollow without understanding, without connection. Nyara had taught him something that had been lost on him all his life. Her strength, born from a history of survival, of resilience, of black culture, had opened his eyes to what true power was. And now, as he stood there, he knew what he needed to do. He was interrupted by a soft knock at the door. Nyara entered without waiting for a response. She had changed in the past few days, less the guarded woman he had known, and more the fierce force of nature she had always been, but now with a gentler edge. She had become the embodiment of everything he hadn't been able to see before: grace, strength, and independence. "I've been thinking," she said, her voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of uncertainty. "It's not enough just to walk away. I have to bring something back. My people, our culture. It's all been silenced, and the longer I stay here, the more I realize I can't just leave. I have to help them heal, help them understand who we are." Zorkan listened, his gaze unwavering as he absorbed her words. He could see now the depth of her convictions, the way her history was as much a part of her as her breath. She was not just fighting for freedom, she was fighting to bring the light of her heritage back into the world, a world that had forgotten it, a world that had silenced it. "What do you need from me?" Zorkan asked, his voice softer now, not out of weakness, but respect. Nyara hesitated for a moment before stepping closer to him. "I need the resources. I need to reach my people, to remind them of what they've lost, to remind them of who they are. But I need your help to do it." Zorkan looked down at her, searching for the usual calculation in her eyes, the hidden agenda that came with every request, but there was none. Instead, he saw something he had never imagined: trust. She was asking him to help her, not as a ruler or as a man who controlled her, but as an ally, as someone who had finally understood the value of her culture, her strength. "What is it you need to do?" he asked, leaning forward, his tone serious. "I want to create a sanctuary," she explained. "A place where our stories, our traditions, our history can be passed down. A place where the pain of the past doesn't define us, but empowers us." Zorkan's chest tightened at her words. The idea of sanctuary was something he had never considered for anyone but himself. It was always about empire, about dominance, about being above. He realized now how different her vision was. It wasn't about control, it was about healing, about creating a space where freedom didn't mean the absence of conflict, but the presence of respect. "You want to give them back their voice," he said quietly. "I do," Nyara affirmed, meeting his gaze with the same unflinching intensity she always had. "I want to help my people rebuild. It's not just about freedom. It's about reclaiming everything we've lost. The music, the stories, the pride in who we are." Zorkan felt something stir inside him. He had spent his life collecting trophies, ruling with an iron fist, but now he saw the cracks in his empire, the emptiness in his conquests. He had never thought to rebuild anything, let alone a people. But Nyara was asking him for something different. She was asking him to be part of something greater than himself, something that didn't rely on power and domination, but on shared history and mutual respect. "I will help you," Zorkan said, his voice resolute. "We'll make it happen. I'll provide the resources you need, the space, whatever you require, but you have to promise me one thing." Nyara raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What's that?" "That you don't do it alone," Zorkan said, stepping closer to her. "That you allow me to stand with you in this, not as a ruler, not as a master, but as an ally." Nyara studied him, searching his eyes for any hint of insincerity. But what she found was a reflection of her own resolve, a man who had come to understand the value of shared strength. Slowly she nodded. "I'll hold you to that," she said, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "And together we'll give them back their history." The sanctuary rose slowly on the outskirts of Borilix's southern hemisphere, where the terrain was fertile, kissed by twin suns and sheltered from the political claws of the central dominion. It was a space Nyara had chosen with intention, away from the towering monuments of power, far from the spires of conquest and control. Here there would be no thrones, no masters, only voices. What began as a single building carved into the hillside became a haven of sound, of story, of shared pain and rebirth. Its walls held echoes of earth, drumming rhythms layered with ancient dialects, murals bursting with colors drawn from African textiles, and holographic archives filled with voices long silenced. Nyara called it Sa'ara. In her dialect, it meant both desert and refuge. She stood in the heart of the courtyard, watching children trace their fingers across illuminated timelines, their laughter rising like birdsong. Beside her, Zorkan observed quietly, hands behind his back. He had helped fund the creation, provided the land, offered transport for any human who wished to come. But he never claimed credit. That too was part of his evolution. "You kept your word," Nyara said, not as praise but as acknowledgement. "I didn't do this for recognition," he replied. "I did it because I couldn't ignore what I helped destroy." She nodded, eyes on the young ones. "This isn't repair. We're not fixing the past, that can't be done. But this is planting. And maybe one day our descendants will live in what grows." Zorkan watched her in the soft light, how the fire within her had only grown brighter with purpose. "Do you ever wonder," he asked, "what would have happened if I never bought you?" Nyara tilted her head. "No," she said simply, "because I don't measure my life by your choices. I measure it by mine. And I chose to survive. I chose to speak. I chose to build." There was no resentment in her voice, no bitterness, only clarity. Visitors from nearby colonies began arriving, curious, skeptical, and often unprepared for what they found. The sanctuary challenged them. It didn't ask for pity. It demanded participation. Zorkan witnessed them listen to poetry about ancestral grief, to testimonies of abduction and resistance, to music born from captivity and molded into freedom. Some left confused, others transformed. One evening, as a group of Borelian scholars exited the sanctuary, one of them turned to Zor Khan. "You've created a paradox," they said. "Power in humility. Influence without ownership." Zor Khan gave no reply. He simply looked to Niara, who stood by a group of elders, their heads bowed in prayer. The paradox, he knew, was never his. It was hers. It had always been. At night, the sanctuary glowed like a pulse beneath the stars. Fires burned in controlled pits, stories shared in the round. Zor Khan often sat among them, silent, listening, learning. He had become something different, neither ruler nor savior but witness. One night Niara approached him as the embers died down. Her skin shimmered in the firelight, her voice low. "You've changed." "I hope so. I can't promise the galaxy will." Zor Khan shook his head. "That's not your burden or mine. But this place, it might outlast us both." They fell into a comfortable silence, the kind only forged through trial, through shared choices and hard-won respect. Niara turned to him with a small smile. "Would you have believed this when you first saw me?" He chuckled, a deep sound. "When I first saw you, I believed I owned a rare creature. Now I understand I met a universe." She didn't respond immediately, but in her eyes something shifted, less guarded, more open. Not love, not yet, but recognition, and maybe, in another era, something more. As the fire flickered between them, Niara whispered, "Then welcome to the beginning." And Zor Khan, who had once ruled empires without ever knowing their names, nodded slowly. To begin again was the greatest power of all. The night had settled across Borelix, and the stars shone bright against the vast expanse of space. The sanctuary, now fully established, pulsed with life. The energy of change, of history reclaimed, flowed through every corner. Niara stood in the center of the courtyard, her face lifted to the sky as the soft wind carried the scent of the native flora. It felt like a dream, one she had almost forgotten she was allowed to have. Zor Khan approached her silently, his steps light on the grass. His presence had become a familiar comfort, not one of dominance, but of shared purpose. He stood beside her, looking up at the stars with the same quiet awe that had become their shared bond. "You've done it," he said, his voice thick with emotion, something raw and unspoken. "You've created something no one can take from you." Niara turned to him, the slightest smile on her lips, her eyes bright but tinged with the weight of everything she had gone through. "No," she said softly, her voice carrying the depth of everything they had faced together. "We've done it. You and me." The phrase was simple, but for Zor Khan it held a world of meaning. It wasn't about ownership, it wasn't about power, it was about partnership. And in that moment, he realized that it was no longer Niara's struggle or his. It was something that belonged to both of them, something they had built together from the ground up. The warmth of their bond was palpable, like the sun setting behind them, creating a golden glow that seemed to bathe the world in new light. Niara stepped closer to him, her hand reaching out to touch his. "I never thought this day would come," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "that I could stand here free. Not just from captivity, but from everything that tried to silence me." Zor Khan looked down at her hand in his. It was the first time in years that he had allowed himself to truly feel. All the years of conquering, of controlling, had been a shield he had now discarded. "I didn't know what freedom meant until I saw it in you," he said. "You taught me what it looks like." "What it feels like." Niara's eyes glistened as she looked up at him. "And you taught me that even the hardest of walls can crumble, not by force, but by understanding." For a moment, they stood there in silence, the air thick with the weight of their shared journey. Zor Khan had given up everything to stand by her, to see the world through her eyes. And Niara, despite all her resistance, had allowed herself to lean on him, to accept that perhaps even the strongest among them needed others. A single tear slid down Niara's cheek, glistening in the moonlight. Zor Khan watched it fall, the emotion it carried heavy and pure. It wasn't a tear of sadness or loss, it was a tear of victory, of triumph. Of knowing that, despite everything, she had come through to the other side. Her tears had always held a meaning. The first one had marked a turning point, a crack in the walls Zor Khan had built. This one was different. It was the final release of everything she had been through and everything she had become. Zor Khan reached up, his hand gently brushing the tear from her cheek. "You've earned this," he said softly, the weight of his words lingering in the air. "This is your freedom." Niara smiled, the tear now gone, but the feeling it left behind would stay with her forever. "And it's mine to keep," she whispered. As they stood together looking out at the horizon, Niara knew that the future wasn't defined by the chains of her past. It was her own to shape, her own to live, and for the first time she felt the weight of possibility, not burden but freedom. Zor Khan, once a ruler who had controlled everything around him, now understood the greatest freedom of all, to stand beside someone not as a master, but as an equal. And in that silence, they both knew that no matter what the future held, they had built something together that could never be taken away.